this crisis, how they're innovating and still contributing to the national crisis and the national economy during COVID-19. Today, I'm really, really excited because we're speaking to the co-founder and CEO of MAX.ng. His name is Adetayo Bamiduro. He's the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of MAX.ng, which is a leading technology-enabled mobility and last-mile delivery service, which has operations in Nigeria, in the southwestern and northwestern areas of Nigeria. So MAX.ng is a company that is no stranger to crisis. In January of 2020, the Lagos state government put a semi-ban on motorcycles, okadas, and keke napeps, which puts their company at great jeopardy. So I'm really excited to be speaking to the CEO of the company to find out a little bit about MAX.ng as a company and also about his entrepreneurial journey so far. So Adetayo, are you there?
Yep.
Welcome to Scaling Through Crisis. It's really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. Excited to be here as well. I look forward to an exciting conversation.
Fantastic. So first of all, let me start by asking you how you're doing. How's everything going with you?
Great. I mean, as you said, earlier, we're all facing a crisis, right? So it's not just one individual or just one company, but it's a shared challenge that we're all facing. But
right.
I mean, through this crisis as well, we're seeing a silver lining, right? So we're still excited about the future, right? And figuring it out one day at a time. But I'm doing great. Yeah, thanks. And how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I can't complain. I'm doing well. And like I said, I'm really excited about our conversation today. I've been following the MAX.ng story for a long time, and I'm really excited to speak to you this afternoon. So could you start by telling us a little bit about MAX.ng?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So Max is a tech company that's solving the last mile mobility and last mile delivery challenge that we face pretty much across sub-Saharan Africa. And the way we're doing that is by solving the critical areas, where both consumers and businesses face challenges when it comes to mobility and package delivery in urban and peri-urban areas in Africa. So some of what we do, to be a bit more specific today, is we're solving the financial inclusion problem for informal drivers. So today, if you're a keke driver or an okada driver, rider, as the case may be, there's no bank that will extend you financing to procure a motorcycle, right? And also, you're likely not trained. You don't know how to use technology. You don't have a digital wallet and things like that. So what Max has done is to create a platform that allows us to solve that problem for the riders, right? And then improve the experience when it comes to things like safety, accessibility, and price consistency with pricing. Those are the things we deliver to consumers. So at the core, what Max really is doing is building the technology and the financial infrastructure to power last mile mobility, which includes transport and package delivery for consumers and for enterprises on the continent.
Fantastic. So tell us a bit about the MAX.ng story. How did you come up with this idea to start a business of this sort?
Sure. Yeah, a few years back, I'd say about 7 years ago, I and my co-founder Chinedu, while we were still grad students at MIT Sloan in Cambridge, we started thinking about what we could do to create jobs on the continent, right? And what sort of solutions we could build that would be scalable and that would impact at least 1 million people. And then we looked at a couple of industries. We looked at agriculture, we looked at e-commerce. And then we zeroed in on e-commerce and realized that in order for digital commerce to scale, it will be important actually to, first solve the problem of transportation and last mile delivery, right? Mm-hmm. Because what we found at that point in time was highly fragmented. So even though you have, hundreds of thousands of motorcycle and tricycle riders all over the country and across almost every state in Nigeria and much of West Africa, there was no, there was no aggregation to it. There was no technology in that industry. So we figured out that if we brought a layer of technology in and added a bit, around financial services, we could aggregate that industry, right? Make it more efficient, take out a lot of the risks and the challenges that, people are scared of, right? And then create jobs in the process, and of course, provide returns to investors who would have put their capital behind us. Right, so we started thinking with that idea. We did a bunch of pitch competitions at MIT. There's a popular competition called the MIT 100K, which is really big. It's campus-wide, and everyone tries so hard to win it, right? Okay, those. In 2015, when I and my co-founder, Chinese, graduated, we had a decision to make, right? We could, go look for jobs like everyone else, go into investment banking or consulting, whatever it is, or work at a big tech company, right, and earn a nice fat salary. Or we could go back, home and try to figure out how to actually solve this last mile delivery and mobility and Okada problem, right? Well, we decided to take the risk and we took the plunge. So we both moved back and started working on the idea in Lagos. And the rest, as they say, is history. It's been quite a ride.
Fantastic. I mean, so you basically saw a problem that you wanted to solve and you essentially solved it. I think we've all seen, I think you call them your champions, if I'm correct, around town with their yellow helmets. And I think when the service such as yours was introduced, it really showed people that you could get around and use technology and also get your products from point A to point B, through the aid of technology. So crisis is not something that MAX.ng is not used to. In January 2020, the Lagos state government had implemented a sort of ban on on some Okadas, keke napeps, and things of that nature. So could you talk to us a little bit about what that was? Because I know a lot of people are wondering kind of where the company is at since then. So could you talk to us about how that impacted your business? Sure,
absolutely. So I think, one important reality that has come out of our experience, and not even just for our industry, but, virtually for any industry. Or so if you're a tech founder, for example, and you're watching this and you feel like, well, in my space, I don't have to talk to the government, I don't want to have anything to do with the government. I can just build my company and focus on my business. That's probably a bad idea, right? Because, in order for society to function, you have that interplay between the private sector and governance or the public sector, right? And when you look at the industry that we're in, logistics and transportation, it's a public good, meaning that if you play in that space, you are interfacing very closely with people. And of course, if you're interfacing very closely with people, then you are interfacing very closely with government, because the government cares about its people. And the government wants to make sure that, whatever happens in that industry is done in such a way that is safe for the people. So historically, one of the key problems we sought out to solve was the problem of safety with the informal motorcycle taxi industry,
right.
The industry, right? By bringing in technology, bringing in organizing, financing, and all of that. But the scale of the problem was so huge, right? That from the government's point of view, the rate at which we were innovating and scaling turned out not to be sufficient in terms of dealing with the crisis that the government at that point in time felt they were facing with the industry, right? So on the one hand, while the Okada industry represented a huge opportunity for us, I'm speaking specifically about Lagos now, right? And we were all excited. There were a bunch of other companies that were trying to attack the same problem as us, right? But despite all the effort that we had put in, the complexities of the challenges that the government was facing at that point in time, especially in Lagos, meant that the scale at which we were operating was not enough to deal with the challenges that industry specifically was facing, right? So just to give a bit of an idea of what we're talking about here, when you look at all the private e-hailing operators in the market combined, we all didn't have more than 10,000 riders on our platforms. But across Lagos, depending on who you ask, you have the minimum of at least, anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million informal Okada riders, right? So the scale of the crisis and of the challenge that the government was facing was so huge, and the government decided to take the easiest way out, and of course I don't blame the government for that. Painful for us as a company, of course,
And for the consumers that were using your bikes every day.
Oh yeah. Quite a painful experience for everyone involved in the industry, right? But I guess in pursuit of a greater Lagos and a greater Nigeria, we recognized the government ultimately had the final say on what they thought. Government in Lagos specifically had the final say on what they thought was the best path forward for solving the transportation and the mobility problem for its people. But I mean, we've moved ever since. We've reallocated a lot of our assets to our package delivery business, which is growing quite nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Also add to that the fact that we're operational in at least 3 other cities. We're launching a few additional cities this year, despite COVID.
What cities are you operating in currently? So I know Lagos, Ondo. Which are the other ones that you operate in?
Oyo State and Kano.
And Kano, okay.
Yeah, so we're currently in 4 states, and so we had the opportunity to redeploy some of our assets and technology and vehicles to the other cities where we're operating in, and we're experiencing very remarkable growth in those cities as well. So big lesson for us, but also we're moving forward. We're quite very well placed to continue to deliver on all the targets we set for ourselves.
Fantastic. And I mean, so how do you lead through a crisis of that sort, and even the current crisis that we're experiencing, COVID-19?
Okay, so leading through crisis, right? In our case, we started out, at least the way we approached it was sort of like, start by identifying who the key stakeholders were, right? So in our case, the government represents a very, very critical, stakeholder in our industry, right? Our customers who use our services, both on the consumer and on the enterprise side. Extremely importantly, right, our independent riders and drivers who work on our platforms. And of course, our employees, right? And then, our investors, right? We've got a fairly large cross-section of investors from North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa as well. Right, and a lot of them were concerned, not just about our company at that point in time, but a lot of these investors I'm talking about also have a lot of other investments in other sectors in Nigeria. So there was generally that concern, not just about the impact this was having on Max, but generally around regulation in general, regulatory certainty in general in Nigeria. So we had about those 5 or 6 stakeholders, and the media, of course, key stakeholders as well. Mm-hmm. So we created a plan to engage very closely with all of them. And one of the things, that we decided on very quickly was to be very transparent, right? Extremely transparent, but also, to keep our emotions under check and ensure that, whatever, communication we put out there, wasn't done in such a way that it represented only our own personal objectives, right? Or our own perspective, mm-hmm. but to ensure that, it represented our views on how to move the industry forward as a whole, right? So we mapped our stakeholders. We engaged with every single one of them very closely. And of course, it wasn't like we understood exactly where things were going to land, right? But we opened up channels of communication with everyone, and we were very honest about it. Expressed our concerns to all of the stakeholders, and we also, very importantly, came up with an action plan, right? Because crying over, what's going on in itself isn't a plan, right? It's important to actually figure out how to navigate through this crisis and how we could ultimately come out on the other end stronger, right? So we came up with an action plan after coming up with our communications plan, and that action plan was to essentially first and foremost comply with the directives of the government, right? There were all kinds of views around we could challenge this in court, or we could seek an injunction and all of that. But for us, we didn't think that was the smart thing to do, especially because we didn't want to lose goodwill, including with the government, right? Because we would continue to have to work with the government, right? And we didn't want to be that company that was, going up in arms against, the government, right? So we came up with an action plan that built first and foremost on engagement, and then we also came up with a business response plan, right? Now, thankfully for us, at that time, about 2 cities had already been fully activated before the Lagos ban. We're already in 2 cities, Lagos and Kano. We were in the process, Lagos and Ondo, I beg your pardon. And we were already in the process of launching Kano. So we just fast-tracked launching in the 2 additional cities that we're currently operational in, right? And that helped, of course, to diffuse some of the challenges that we had around not being able to operate our motorcycle transport business in Lagos. And that also helped instill confidence in our staff, because at that time, a bunch of players in the industry, were cutting staff and laying off, a huge chunk of the workforce. And of course, our employees were concerned as well, right? But we engaged with every single one of them very closely. And we let them know that, hey guys, we're not a Lagos only company. We have a Pan-African, mission. We're already in 2 cities. We're about to launch 2 additional cities. So there's still a ton of work for everyone, right? And we also, we're very lucky with the quality of investors that we have at Max, who are in this with us, for the long haul. And they, were extremely unwavering in their commitment to supporting us as well, as we navigated our way through the crisis. So I would say, building a very effective and strong communications plan, understanding your stakeholders and mapping them out very quickly, and engaging with them in a very honest, open, transparent, and respectful way. And then, of course, next is building on top of all of that, a business response plan to quickly move away, from the epicenter of the crisis and shift the energy of your team, towards more productive engagement, either by pursuing opportunities in other cities or launching completely new product lines. So that's essentially what we did, and that has worked out quite well for us. Our team, feels as motivated as ever. Our investors are extremely happy. We have a bunch of new products that we've been cooking. We'll be making a bunch of announcements soon, right? So we went from navigating through a very challenging crisis to coming out a lot stronger. And of course, shortly after then, the pandemic crisis.
Right. So how is COVID-19 affecting MAXNG right now? I mean, you've experienced the crisis of the ban, and you had to speak to your investors. You kind of had to pivot and re-innovate, essentially. And then 6 months later, or 5 months later, COVID-19, takes the world by storm. So how has MAX.ng been affected by the COVID-19 crisis?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you start by looking at the high level, reduction in economic activity in itself implies, that the impact cuts across, right? So the enterprises that we support, the people that we transport in the other cities where we operate in, for example, all of that activity went from 100 to about, in some places went from 100 to 0. In some other places it went from 100 to maybe about 40, right? So that in itself is, meant we were instantly impacted. Now, the thing, however, is the fact that because we were already in crisis management mode before the pandemic hit, right? We were already, thinking on our feet, figuring out new product lines that would be much more resistant, to economic shocks, either through, regulatory changes or not like we were thinking about the pandemic, but we were already in that crisis management mode,
right?
Thinking about how to ensure we built a much more resilient business model. Now, the advantage we had was the fact that a lot of the technology and the processes and the capabilities that we had built over the last 5 years were already, strong enough to give us leverage in almost any industry that we were looking to enter, right? So whether it's, it's supply chain for FMCGs, right? Or an online delivery platform for food, right? Or scaling up our product for, grocery stores and all of that. Or even, doing large-scale supply chain for large enterprises like FMCGs, from moving products from up country to their factories. We had already built the capabilities to make that happen. So the other impact of the pandemic, however, was it forced us to then also begin to think not just about our own business model resilience, but also think about the behavioral changes that would likely result, during and especially post-COVID, right? So, we started doing a lot of work figuring out, what would consumption habits be post-COVID, right? What would people spend money on? What kind of needs will be uppermost in people's minds, right? So the impact from a business standpoint, of course, ultimately resulted in lower, economic activity for us and less revenues momentarily. But at the same time, we've sort of like taken that as a challenge to then, build business models that are more resilient, not just against regulatory challenges, but also against changes in our consumption habits as a result of the pandemic.
Right. Okay. And how large is your staff strength currently, would you say, across Nigeria?
Okay, so our direct employees over 100 right now still.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what about drivers? How many drivers do you have on the roads at the moment, would you say?
Okay, so a couple thousand in our network still.
A couple of thousands. Okay. Yeah. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about leadership in crisis. So what are some of the changes that you've had to do internally? How did you communicate with your staff about the COVID-19 crisis, and how, what are the changes that you've been experiencing, and how do you lead internally through this COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah, fantastic point. So a couple points I would make on this. At Max, I'm my co-founder and our executive team. One of the things that really, is different about how we lead is the fact that we lead by example, right? So we never ask people to do what we haven't done ourselves, right? So, for example, if you're going to make adjustments around income, for example, right? And you want to say, okay, guys, there's a crisis, we need to readjust compensation a little bit. We don't just push that to our colleagues, right? We lead by example by saying, hey guys, we are going on XYZ pay cut ourselves, right? And we think everyone needs to do this in the best interest of the company in the short term, right? So I think the fact that we have led by example historically, right, made it extremely easy for us. So we had, significant deposits in that proverbial emotional bank account with our colleagues, and they knew that, whatever we asked them to do, we were doing, most times we were doing even more than they were, right? Mm-hmm. So number one is leading by example. Number two is very, honest communication, very honest and consistent communication, right? Mm-hmm. So we didn't allow, opportunity for rumors and stuff like that. I and my co-founder would get on Zoom calls with our colleagues, once, sometimes even twice a day, giving them real-time updates and real-time feedback on what's going on, and how we were thinking about responding, right? So we clearly didn't come across as the know-it-all, be-it-all type of leader, because no one fully understood what was going on initially, right? And we were very transparent and open and honest about it, right? But one thing that was equally important, though, was, right, even in the midst of the uncertainty, we let them know that we're going to come out of this on the other side stronger, right? And there's no way we're giving up. There's no way we're, resorting to fate or whatever it is, right? We let them know that we hadn't figured out everything, but we also let them know that we were still very confident in the future, and that this was a momentary challenge that would eventually, come to pass, right? So I think, being honest and consistent in communication, right? Leading by example, and also instilling confidence and motivating the team that we would power through this together. Those three things, we ensured we did all of those.
I like the fact that you led by example. It's one thing we understand that, most businesses have to experience pay cuts and things of that sort, but usually that's left for the employees of the company. So nice to see that you led by example in that way as well. And I'm sure that actually builds a lot of camaraderie within the business that you operate.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Definitely did.
No, fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about the transportation industry a little bit in the country. What are your views on the current infrastructure of the transportation industry in Nigeria at the moment?
Okay, sure. So, I mean, irrespective of what my personal views are facts, right? So the fact is it's highly unregulated right now for the most part across Nigeria. It's still heavily informal, very low technology penetration, very low penetration of financial digital payment platforms as well. So it's not that different from what it was as a whole. It's not that different from what it was 10 years ago or even 20 years ago, right? In a few, with the exception of a few places like, say, Lagos, where you've seen remarkable investments in the BRT transport system, that has been a fantastic project that has added to the transportation mix, right? And say maybe a few reforms around, 2- and 3-wheel mobility, you still haven't seen anywhere close to the amount of investment that's required, right? So transportation is still a huge challenge. A survey that was done a few years back on the amount of money that, or the share of income that the average Nigerian spends on transportation, especially in urban areas, it's still as high as anywhere between 30 to 40%, right? Absolutely, so every Nigerian is still spending 30 to 40% of their income on transportation. So, it's still too expensive, right? And the way to drive, transportation costs down and to make it more efficient is to double down on investments, right? Attract a lot more investments in Nigeria. I would say at least, we're looking at $5 to $10 billion in investments.
5 to 10 billion. Okay.
$5 to $10 billion in investments. Beyond that also is implementing a much more, robust and consistent regulatory framework that gives the sort of assurance that investors need to be able to, commit to such huge capital outlays, right? The government alone is clearly not going to be able to solve this problem, right? Overnight, right? Nigeria has literally grown from, I don't know how many people we were a few decades back, maybe 60 million people to 200 million right now, right? And our growth is not even slowing down, right? If you look at the World Bank's estimates, they say we'll be at just under 500 million people at the middle of the century, right? So if you look at the stats, they're very scary, right? And if people are going to be productive, right, one of the most important areas we have to invest in outside of education and healthcare is transportation. People need to be able to move around efficiently. People also need to be able to move packages and products around efficiently as well. We need to be a lot more tightly integrated as a country, and our cities need to function a lot more efficiently as well. So current state of transportation today, it's nowhere near where it needs to be. It's still way too expensive, way too inefficient, way too informal. And now is the time, for the federal government especially, and of course the state governments as well, to take this a little bit more seriously, right? And partner with private sector players to introduce reforms driven primarily by technology and by financial inclusion. Right.
So you mentioned that financial inclusion was kind of the reason why you started MAX.ng. You kind of wanted to bring jobs to the continent. I'd like to talk a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey or your career journey before starting MAX.ng, just to see if there's anything that our audience can learn from. So before you started MAX.ng, what were you doing? I know that you went to MIT and that you worked in the private sector before moving back to Nigeria. So can you tell us a bit about your life before being the CEO of MAX.ng?
Sure, happy to go into that. So I'll probably start by talking about my experience growing up, right? So a family of 5 kids. My dad is an academic. My mom worked as a journalist for many years.
Oh, great.
My immediate older brother is 5 years older than I am, right? So I spent a lot of my time growing up alone, because we all went to school, went to boarding schools and all that. So I stayed home, tinkering about with a lot of stuff and just learning to be independent. And then my parents also are, they taught me to be independent very, very, very early on, right? They they would give me the basic resources I needed and tell me to go figure things out. So, so I grew up to be, very independent minded, but also very experimental, trying to figure out how things actually worked, right? And what I could do. So right out of school, I started my own small software company building software for people. One of the most interesting projects I worked on actually was a tracking platform for cars and vehicles, right? While I was still a computer science student.
So you always liked cars and transportation and things of that sort, apparently.
I've been hooked on that, ever since.
Okay.
But after a short while, doing that, my mom thought I needed to get a proper job. So I started out, my formal career working for a company called UAC, Nigeria, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Nigerian company, used to be called the Royal Niger Company, filled with so much history, right? And I worked across a bunch of divisions while I was there. It was a short stint. Shortly after, I worked as a consultant at PricewaterhouseCoopers for a little bit as well. And then I moved to work in the oil and gas industry, specifically in the natural gas industry. I worked at a plant in Bonny Island for a company called Nigeria Liquefied Natural Gas. And that was an amazing experience. NLNG, is one of the biggest success stories to ever come out of Nigeria, right? So working with such a hugely talented community of people and experts from all over the world, I was responsible for a bunch of things, but one of the most exciting roles I played while I was there, was managing engineering and process control systems for plants that were worth about I think at that point in time, $6 billion, right? So it was an incredible responsibility that I had. But after a couple of years, there, I knew it was about time to actually go use all of the diverse experiences that I had as a consultant, working in manufacturing, working in oil and gas, and building software. I thought it was time to bring all of those skills and those experiences together to solve a compelling problem. But I realized that I wanted a deeper global perspective before doing that. So I decided to, go and study in the States at MIT Sloan School of Management for 2 years. And that was a transformational experience in a couple of ways. I think one of the most powerful things I learned during my 2 years there was, sort of like really understanding what leadership really is about, right? And, contrary to a lot of what I'd seen, growing up in Nigeria, at least in public, not in my house, but in public, where leadership, equates with having authority or being the boss, right? Or being a political leader. There was amazing to see a very different side to leadership, which essentially was, taking a step to solving a problem that affects a community, right? And you had that all over the MIT campus, right? So, with all the experiences and the career experience that I had and the time I spent at Sloan, all of that, I combined that into I put all of those experiences together to then start working on a compelling problem that would impact a lot of people, literally millions of people. And that's what I would say, was the journey that led to founding Max.
Fantastic. I mean, it's a very interesting journey. So you were working here in Nigeria first, and then you decided to go over to the States to go to MIT. MIT is one of the best universities in the world. So what would you say are some of the things that you learned there? I mean, you talked about leadership and being able to lead from experience and kind of leading by example. But what are some of the things that you learned at MIT that you feel like you're still using today as the CEO of MAX.ng?
Sure. So I think the most transformational, part of that experience really is the quality of your classmates, right? And the quality of people you meet with. Of course, the quality of the faculty is amazing as well, but I mean, think about sitting in class and, the guy who's sitting right next to you is the guy that helped design, the wings for the Boeing, for Boeing 787, right? Mm-hmm. And the other guy he's built a mini device that he launched into space all by himself, right? So you get really challenged, seeing, the incredible things that extremely humble people, and when you talk to these people, it's not written on their faces, you don't know anything, right? But the moment you get to know them and you learn more about them, you see the incredible things that they've done, that humbles you, right? I think the other thing also is the quality of the alumni network, right? So you've got folks, who've left campus for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, who come back and who are, literally billionaires in USD, right? Not Naira. and they come to class and they talk to you, right? And they're not, you don't find them with sirens or escorts or stuff like that. They're just wearing, jeans and t-shirts, and you can access them. And the guy is worth like, 10% of your country's GDP. That does something to you that, the purpose of being a human really is to add value, right? Is to deliver impact. And while doing that, you can still maintain basic humanity, right? So, beyond the quality of the faculty, beyond the course content itself, beyond the amazing, equipment and facilities and all the stuff you have over there, and I would say the quality of the people, right? That you meet with in terms of their impact, what they've done, what their dreams are, it's completely mind-boggling.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've heard great things about MIT. And like you said, imagine being a classmate with someone who, created the wings for a Boeing plane. That's just really mind-blowing. So I can kind of see where, your leadership style kind of comes from, and kind of the way that you and your co-founder carry yourselves. I think it shows in the school that you guys, or that you went to. So now I want to talk a bit about raising finance. I mean, you don't have a MAX.ng without significant investments. So talk to us a little bit about raising funds for your business. What was that like?
Sure. Fundraising is always a pretty tough topic to talk about.
Right.
It's pretty clear, one of the biggest challenges on the continent today is fundraising, right? There isn't sufficient capital for the challenges and the opportunities that we're all, trying to work on, right? So that said, there's also something else. There's when you look at it through the lens of the investors, they struggle to find, teams that have done their homework, mapping out what the challenges really are, and figuring out the right approach, right, and the right technology to solve those problems, right? So I think that is really starting to change now. Over the last couple of years, in the last decade, I guess, you've seen a lot of approaches that attempt to replicate Western models on the continent, right? And a lot of those approaches, to be honest and to be frank, quite haven't worked. So on the one hand, there's not enough capital, for all the amazing ideas that people are working on. But on the other hand as well, we as founders and entrepreneurs and innovators, we also have a lot of work to do in terms of mapping out the opportunities in a very clear, compelling, and authentic way, right? So, what goes into fundraising? How do you successfully raise capital, right? I'll talk about what we've done in our own experience. I think the first thing is identifying a really compelling problem to work on, right? These days, no one wants to fund an investment in a vitamin. People want to fund investments in aspirins, right? And what I mean by that is you need to be working on a pain point that is really significant, something that people absolutely need, right? Not some nice, fancy app that nobody really needs, right? Mm-hmm. That's one. Another thing also is doing your research, right? So it's not enough to read articles and read reports and publications from the IMF or from the World Bank or from the National Bureau of Statistics, and on that basis build a business plan. No, that's not enough, right? Mm-hmm. The most important validation you actually need is a paying customer, right? So interacting with people or with the customers or the stakeholders in your industry at a deep level and taking time to actually map out all of the elements involved in creating value is extremely important. And a lot of people are just not patient enough, to do that. Now, the third thing that I will say is the good old, thinking big, right? I think one key difference that a lot of people still don't understand between an SME and a startup, big difference, right? Just because you're starting a new business doesn't mean you are a startup in the way the term is used in investing circles, right? So the definition of a startup is an IDE, an innovation-driven enterprise that's focused on scaling very fast, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're a startup, your goals, your ultimate objective is world domination in that area that you're in, right? So starting a new, online grocery delivery company that wants to serve only Lagos, right? It's not even necessarily a startup in the way venture capitalists think, right? So then, on the one hand, you have to be working on a compelling problem. You must have done your homework. You must understand the value chain end to end and all of that. On the other side as well is you must have clarity on how you're going to scale this company, right, to a national champion or even a regional champion across West Africa or whatever it is your goal is. So doing all of those, right, is what then gets you and is the base minimum you need to be able to successfully fundraise. Mm-hmm. After you've done that, then there's a bunch of other tricks, I'll call them tricks, right? But not trick as in trick, but tricks as in understanding how to navigate the process, right? Building relationships, doing a ton of travel, correctly understanding the risks that are involved in your industry, understanding, what segments to focus on, and also understanding the theses of the investors that they're trying to reach. So, for example, if you've got a fantastic idea and you've dotted all your T's and I's, and you have a fantastic idea in mobility, there's no point approaching an investor who's focused on agriculture, right? Because it's just not their space. Mm-hmm. So there's also a lot of work around doing your homework, connecting with the right investors who are focused on your industry or on your geography. Getting all of that right is also a ton of work.
Okay. So I think I want to go into questions. We have a few questions from the audience. And there's a question directly related to the point that you just made. So Lucky here asked, at what point do you know that you had validated your business idea? So at what point did you know that the MAX.ng concept was a viable business idea?
Fantastic. So market validation is, your approach to market validation or to product validation varies. It differs from product to product. Mm-hmm. From industry to industry, and also from market to market, right? So in the US or in Europe, engagement, user engagement in terms of having a lot of people download your platform and use it, mm-hmm. Oftentimes is used as validation, and there are reasons for that, right? In this part of the world, market validation is a bit trickier, right? So the fact that a lot of people are using it in itself does not necessarily mean you've got a viable product, because a lot of people might be using it, but a lot of people might not be willing to pay for it, right? So, because there are limited monetization, second or third order monetization possibilities in Nigeria, and I will explain in a second what that means. Unlike what you have in the US, where, for example, Facebook continued to grow for many years without, with zero revenues, right? But eventually they were able to figure out how to monetize the huge amounts of data they had. Mm-hmm. In Nigeria and in most parts of Africa today, our markets are not as developed enough yet for you to rely too much on monetization at the second or the third order level, right? So here, for us, how did we know we had validated our product? Once we found people paying for it, right, and not haggling too much, then we knew we were onto a fantastic idea. If people are not paying for what you're doing, right, and you haven't figured out a monetization strategy that has a high chance of success or high probability of success in present day Nigeria, right, you're probably on a long thing.
So I think if people are paying for your service or product, it's pretty much a validation that you have something that's viable, essentially.
They're paying and they're not haggling too much. Yeah.
So they're paying and they're comfortably paying in the sense they don't feel like they're being. They see the value in the product that you're giving, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So we have another question here. A lot of people say that the next Mark Zuckerberg is going to be, which is a founder of Facebook, is going to be found in Africa. In your view, how do we ensure that we actually get to a place whereby we actually have somebody from the continent of Africa with the kind of tech success such as Mark Zuckerberg? So, you've heard this story about, the next Mark Zuckerberg, will be found in Africa. A lot of people say that Africa is the next tech haven. So I guess this person's question is, how do we ensure that we get a Mark Zuckerberg out of Africa?
Okay, great question. So I'll answer this question this way, right? So I'll interpret the question as, how do we create a lot of tech successes, right? Because we're not looking for a Mark Zuckerberg, right?
Yeah, we're not looking for a Mark Zuckerberg. We're looking for our own person. But I mean, in terms of like the scale of success, or I guess, how do we ensure more tech successes on the continent?
Excellent question. So, let's even break Mark Zuckerberg into his most basic components, right? So Mark didn't just wake up and build Facebook, right? Mark, how did he build Facebook, right? There was a vibrant investing ecosystem already in the US, right? The market was there, our smartphones were there, digital payment systems were already built, and I could go on and on and on and on and on about all the infrastructure that already existed before Mark could build Facebook, right? Mm-hmm. If you think about Uber as well, it's the same. There was already Google Maps, there was already digital payment systems, there were already car leasing companies that were pretty efficient, and all Travis Kalanick and Gary Kram did was to layer their product on top of that. So I think the question then is okay, we're trying to build a lot of technology success stories, right? But what are the pieces that are required for us to achieve that? Because what we're looking for are not outliers. We're not looking for unicorns. We're looking at how do we build a successful technology ecosystem. And then after we've done that, 20 years from now, we could then have our own, Mark Zuckerbergs and the rest of them. So it's a pretty simple answer, but it's tough to execute. So we need much more vibrant technology funding ecosystems. We need a lot more risk capital in the environment. We need a lot more clarity on regulation, right? If you look at the United Kingdom, for example, a few years back, because they felt like they were kind of like taking a backseat on innovation, they started working extremely hard to attract innovators and also attract risk capital to the UK, right? So in fact, there's a program where as an investor, if you invest in a startup in the UK today and you lose all your money, you would get as much as 70% of that money as tax credits, right? So in fact, while I was at MIT, I remember attending a conference where the current Prime Minister of the UK, then he was the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, came, and he worked so hard to pitch every single MIT student to move to London upon graduation to come and work on startup ideas. Right. So why are we not doing that? Right? Why are we not doing that as a country? So what is the answer to the question you've asked? There's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. There needs to be more funding. We need to create more technology parks, free trade zones that would encourage people to take risks, right? Because building successful tech companies requires a huge amount of risk, right? There's also a lot of investments that have to be made even in market efficiencies, right? How do you make it easier for technology companies to be able to sell their products both locally and internationally? How do you make that happen? How do you guarantee and provide the resources that are needed? How do you drive down the cost of the internet, right? How do you help consumers to access even much, cheaper smartphones? How do you reduce the cost of data across the country? So there's a lot of these things that need to be done to continue to aggressively drive, the adoption of technology and to drive innovation, right? So unfortunately, a lot of these things can't just be done by entrepreneurs. A lot of these things have to be done also, by the government, right? So until the government does what the government, needs to do, what do we do? Well, we keep struggling, right? You keep trying hard to either join international accelerator programs that can give you a bit more profile out there and add to your credibility, and then therefore making it easier for you to raise capital internationally. In our case, 95% of the capital that we've raised at Max has come from Asian, European, and American investors, right? I remember pitching my heart out, to countless investors out of Nigeria, but they just they didn't get it, and I don't blame them, right? For them, they just see a huge amount of risk. How are you going to get your money back? How are you going to figure this out? How are you going to figure that out, right? So, and I don't blame them. I don't judge them. I used to before, but I don't judge them anymore. You're right. So until a lot of that is done by the government, right? You then have to figure out, how do I improve my credibility? How do I connect with investors, both locally and even more importantly, globally as well, to back the idea that I have. So you have to figure out hacks, until, the local ecosystem improves.
I mean, you make such a great point. It's interesting that such a high percentage of your investment came from outside the country or outside the continent, but that's a story that's heard throughout a lot of tech startups, especially. So I guess that brings me to a point about, impact investing or investing from, like you said, a local ecosystem. I think we really need to encourage people with means within the country and within the continent to start investing in African companies, because essentially we're going to get to a point whereby most of the companies that we're extremely proud of are mainly invested in by foreign companies. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But in order for us to grow our continent and to grow our economy, we have to invest within our own ecosystem. So I really hope that we get to a stage whereby investing in a company like MAX.ng is a no-brainer for a local investor. Because as you see, your company has been able to pivot throughout this crisis. Transport is now, it might actually become an essential service. So that might actually change the way that investors look at an industry like yours.
Yeah, great point. I mean, there's still a lot to think about, right? It's still extremely hard out there for entrepreneurs and innovators, right? So the fact that we are at the position that we're in today, we still consider ourselves extremely fortunate, right? And I have go out always to smart guys with smart ideas, smart guys and girls with smart ideas that are struggling so hard, to build companies and innovate, but are just not getting the type of support that is needed. I think one thing that I would say, to investors, local investors especially, right, is, making an investment and kind of like just sitting down and hoping that, that money, turns into a great product is probably not going to happen for most people, right? So more than just providing capital, a lot of what young people and young innovators need also is mentorship, right? So we need our high network individuals to really handhold and get really involved in helping young entrepreneurs figure out how to build and scale their products and their companies, right? So figuring out things like there was a research that was done at MIT last year on the average age of a successful founder, right? And it came to about somewhere around 42 years old, right? Even in the US. And the question then is why, right? Do 42-year-old people have better ideas than 20-year-olds? Absolutely not. But what the 42-year-olds have that 20-year-olds don't have? That is networks, right? So, it's one thing to build a fantastic product. It's another thing to have all the relationships you need to actually sell those products right across the country, right? So, and this is where investors and high net worth individuals, are coming, right? A lot of the expertise and the experience that you've built and accumulated over the years, you should absolutely figure out ways to make that available to upcoming innovators, right? And help them understand how to actually succeed in the marketplace beyond just building a nice app, or a nice service.
Okay. I think you make a great point. I have two more questions for you. The first question is, what advice do you have for young tech aspiring? So let's say you're a young woman or a young man. You have a great idea and you want to utilize tech. However, you're not sure how to access finance, you have an idea, that's all you have. Do you have any advice for people looking to get into, scaling a big idea or getting into the tech space? If you could go back maybe from when you started MAX.ng, if there's anything that you wish that you knew. So any advice that you have for aspiring entrepreneurs or tech entrepreneurs?
Okay, sure. So, I mean, there are at least 3 or 4 ways to drive from the island to the mainland, right? So, different people have different paths, and I would, mention some of my own recommended paths that innovators should take, right, in their journey to ultimately building out to something phenomenal, right? I think one of the smartest things to do actually is to work closely with a tech founder, right? Because what that allows you to do is to understand how this is done, right? You can still try from day one to go build your own company and your own product, right? But there's just so much to this that the learning phase can be very, very intense, and the journey can be very steep, especially if you don't have a lot of capital to experiment with, right? So working with at a high growth company. So for example, if you want to do something in fintech, right, go look for fintech companies, and I assure you, if there's one thing that every tech company out there is looking for, they're looking for really solid people to come and work with them. Folks who have the mindset of a partner. You might be an employee, but you have the mindset of a partner, right? Every single startup out there is looking for folks like that. So, doing 2 years, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years at a decent tech company that you admire is always a really fantastic idea, right? The other thing is, if you feel like you're ready right off the bat, joining accelerator programs and incubators is always a really fantastic idea. And it doesn't mean that you don't know what needs to be done, but what you get from those communities is much more than just knowledge, right? You get access, you get networks, you see what other people are doing. That allows you to also, think a little bit with your own idea, improve it a little bit, take, some ideas from other people and pivot if necessary. So, immersing yourself in that ecosystem, either by working directly with tech companies and founders that you have a lot of respect for, or going straight into an incubator or an accelerator program in Nigeria, or if possible, in the US or in Europe, is always a fantastic idea. So those are 2 parts that a lot of people take. There are a few other parts outside of that, but the other parts I feel like sometimes are a little harder. You could do something similar to a little bit of what I did, which was, I went and studied at a school that was very well known for innovation, right? So there's a bunch of schools in Europe, in Asia, and in the United States that are known for having a very strong innovation culture. So you could also go get a degree there, go study there, and then before you come out, figure out your own startup idea.
Right. I mean, that's some really great advice. So we've spoken extensively about your company, MAX.ng, and when you started it, I'm sure that you obviously had a vision and a mission for it. So in the next, let's say, 20 years, where would you like to see MAX.ng?
Okay, well, I mean, our mission at Max is to make mobility safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable through the deployment of high-performance technology and operators, right? And that's a huge amount of work. 20 years from now, we want to see our technology powering our every single large-scale industry you can think about. So from agri to people transportation, to FMCG distribution, including direct-to-consumer platforms like grocery delivery as well. You will find Max technology or Max services powering significant chunks of each and every one of those value chains.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to seeing that in 20 years and in the time to come. So we're kind of getting to the end of the show. I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to say before we end the program, anything that you want our audience to hear from before we go.
Yeah, I guess, my parting point would be around, these are really, really challenging times, right, in Nigeria and across the region. And a lot of people are going to continue to feel the pressure to sort of like give up, right? or to completely move out, and just escape the crisis and the mess.
Yeah.
But from what I have seen, from my vantage point, there's still a huge amount of opportunities out here, right?
Right.
Now, a lot of those opportunities might not be sexy. They might not come across as very exciting and very attractive externally. But if you look, if you look closely enough, you would find, tons of opportunities. And if you're willing to put in the effort, right, you would come out very, very successful. That is almost guaranteed. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, huge challenges across the country, across the continent today, but also huge opportunities for folks who see themselves as, playing a critical role in changing the trajectory of Nigeria and of Africa as a whole, right? We can, Canada and America can't take all of us, right? So some of us have to stay back and figure out how to fix this mess. So,
no, I mean, thank you so much, Adetayo. It's been really nice speaking to you. And like you said, we can't all contribute to the brain drain. Some of us have to stay here and develop our continent. So I'm definitely with you on that. It's been really a great pleasure speaking to you, Adetayo. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us on another edition of Scaling Through Crisis. I learned a lot about your journey, your entrepreneurship journey, and just the kind of business that you're building with MAX.ng. And I'm sure that we all look forward to seeing the amazing things that you guys end up doing.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for your time, and have a great day. And I look forward to staying in touch with you.
All right, then. Cheers. Yeah, bye-bye.
All right. Bye.